Okay, should be recording. I was going to try to do this outside, but it was way too windy. There we go. So today will be our last Sunday school for a while. We would normally stop Memorial Day weekend, and this will allow Pastor Terry and I to focus on regathering plans. So as soon as we are able, we'd have things kind of in place. My jaw hit the floor when I looked at the numbers yesterday for new cases. It was 117. And yeah, so that keeps pushing us back. But we're working on other things, getting plans in place and amplification systems and all stuff. So once things start leveling out and decreasing, we will hopefully have a plan in place. But today, it's a really good place to kind of end this section. I mean, Women of the Bible can continue for almost ever. I have a retired priest friend who started a Women of the Bible, and he titled his Good Girls and Bad Girls before he retired, and that was 7 years ago, and they're still doing it. So there's plenty of material. But today we will spend some time with Ruth. Do you like Ruth? He doesn't really care. He's just happy he's with me. So this is her name in Hebrew. Most nouns in Hebrew and verbs are only 3 letters in actuality. So Ruth is Ruth, and then once it gets to Greek, because Hebrew doesn't have a th sound, so once it gets to Greek, it becomes Roth. Same thing, transferring into Latin, and then in English, Ruth
and
Bubbles. Yeah, the important things, Ruth and Bubbles. So the story of Ruth is an idyll. It is an idyllic pastoral love story. It barely mentions God. God is called out by name. Naomi yells at God in frustration, and then they give praise to God at one point. But unlike Judges or Exodus, God doesn't speak. God doesn't take a active role, but God is definitely behind the scenes in the story of Ruth. The same thing happens in the book of Esther. So there are 2 books in the Old Testament that are named after women. Now you're getting fussy. That are named after women. There we go. And so Ruth and Esther, and neither of them really mention God. God is not mentioned at all in Esther. So the story of Ruth is still not written like a history, but it's almost a fairy tale. Think Cinderella. There are a lot of similarities with the Brothers Grimm fairy tales. And although the story is set in the time of the Judges, that's how the book begins, its written style suggests it's not written until the 5th century BCE, with the return from exile. So this is writing it down going, oh yes, remember the good old days of peace and of Ruth and of Boaz. There aren't the kind of conflicts that were happening in Israel at the time. There's nothing about idol worship. So it's really looking on this ideal story. The book of Ruth serves as a tie. The story of Ruth and Boaz serves as redemption for the Moabites, as well as ties together the conquering legends, that's Joshua and Rahab, and the chronicled history of the kings, David and Solomon. So first, who remembers who the Moabites are?
Oh.
Quiz time.
It's like, didn't you just tell us this last week?
Are these the ones that are descended from
Lot's daughters?
Yes,
Yes.
the incestuous relationship between Lot and his daughters, because they thought that the world had completely ended and they were all that was left. They thought this was like Noah. So they get their father drunk and they sleep with them and they have children, and those are the Moabites, which is the ancient enemy of Israel. So we're going to paint them in as bad a light as possible, right? And then we get the story of Ruth, where redemption for Israel really comes through this Moabite woman, this foreigner. There's a lot of redemption through these women that should not be, the good part of the story. Rahab is Boaz's mother. Rahab is the prostitute, a pagan prostitute. And Ruth is King David's great-grandmother. And she is a Moabite. And it is this line of David and Solomon that unifies the kingdom. Eventually it's going to break it all apart, but that's another story, another day. Would somebody be willing to read just this top portion? I want you to think of this story like a Shakespearean romance. And in all of Shakespeare's love stories, their romances all begin with tragedy.
And I can't see it all because there's all you guys is blocking it.
At the top of that, there should be like a minus sign and a little bit bigger, and then 2 dots, and then
Oh, yeah. So minus?
Hit the minus and will disappear, and you'll just be able to see the screen.
Oh,
I can read it.
okay.
Well, I've got some other ones to read too. So Denise, why don't you read this one, and Nolan, you can read the next one.
Sounds
Okay.
good.
And it happened in the days with the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man went, and something's blocking it there,
From Bethlehem.
went from Bethlehem to sojourn in the plains of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. And the man's name was Amalek, and his wife's name was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon, and Chilion, Ephratites,
Ephratites.
That's a bad word.
Ephratites from Bethlehem of Judah. And they came to the plains of Moab, and they were there. And Amalek, Naomi's husband, died, and she, together with her 2 sons, was left. And they took for themselves Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpha, and the name of the other Ruth. And they dwelled there some 10 years. And the 2 of them, Mahlon and Chilion, died as well. And the woman was left of her 2 children and her husband. And she rose, she and her daughters-in-law, and turned back from the plains of Moab. For she had heard in the plains of Moab that the Lord had singled out his people to give them bread.
So this is going to remind the reader of an older story, of the story of Jacob and his sons. There was and Abraham too, right? There was a famine in the land, and they went somewhere else to get food. For Abraham and for Jacob, it was to Egypt. And Israel has a problem at this point doing anything with Egypt for obvious reasons. And they are so hungry. They're in Bethlehem, which is just here, southwest of Jerusalem. They are so hungry that Elimelech and Naomi and their sons, they travel across the Judean wilderness, around the Dead Sea, and into the land of the enemy of Moab. So don't go to Egypt, but they go somewhere else where they might not be treated well. And we'll find out they are treated very well for the most part. Now, Elimelech means my God, El, is king. So this is setting us up for they are true believers. They are not idol worshipers. They follow the one true God. Naomi has this beautiful fairy tale-like name. It means sweet or pleasant, and that's going to play an important role later. Mahlon means sickness, and Kilion means destruction.
Well, she shouldn't have named him that. They might have made
Exactly. So this is telling us at the very beginning that these two kids are not going to last long.
Yeah, why would they name their children that?
Well, the prophets gave their kids bizarre names.
Yeah, we're thankful that Lucas's name means light. So, Pastor Terry, isn't Pastor Carolyn's son named Kilian?
I think so. Must have just liked the sound of it.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, no,
It's Hebrew.
Killian will name. I wonder if is there an Irish meaning?
Yeah.
So it's sickness and destruction. Then we have these two Moabite women who are Orpha or Orpah. You'll see it also said that way and written that way.
Oprah's named after her. Mom just spelled it wrong. That's true. She just spelled it wrong.
Well, the PHP letter in Hebrew is the same. So it just depends on what vowel you have with it. And there aren't actually any vowels in the original written Hebrew. So the rabbis who are translating sometime in the Middle Ages, some say Orpha and some say Orpah. But Orpha probably comes from the Hebrew word oref, which means nape. So it's the nape of the neck, and indicates that later in the story, she will turn back to Moab from Naomi. We don't really know what Ruth means. There is a midrash that says that Kilion, her husband, named, or I think Mahlon, her husband, named her, gave her this Hebrew name. And it might be a spelling of Reut, which means friendship, which is also where we get Raphael, which is friend of God, or from the verbal stem R, Revav He, which suggests well-watered or fertile, which is going to tell us a little bit, give us an insight into what's going to happen later in the story too. Something about kids.
Yeah, excuse us for a moment.
Faithful to Naomi, each in their own way. Nolan, would you mind reading this one?
And they raised their voice and wept once more. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "Look, your sister-in-law has gone back to your people. Go back after your sister-in-law." And Ruth said, "Do not entreat me to forsake you, to turn back from you. For wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people is my people, and your God is my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. So may the Lord do to me, or even more, for only death will part you and me." Then she saw that she was insisting on going with her, and she ceased speaking to her. And the two of them went until they came to Bethlehem. And it happened as they came to Bethlehem that the whole town was astir over them. And the woman said, "Is this Naomi?" And she said, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for
Shaddai.
has dealt great bitterness to me. I went out full, and empty did the Lord bring me back. Why should you call me Naomi, when the Lord has borne witness against me, and Shaddai has done me harm?" And Naomi came back to her daughter-in-law with her who was coming back from the plains of Moab. And they had come to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest.
So first, Shaddai you may have heard as El Shaddai, and it just means Almighty, is kind of how it's translated. It is only used without the El, which means God. So El Shaddai, God Almighty, only used without the El in poetry. So the writer of Ruth is waxing poetically at the moment. Naomi tells the women to go back to their own people, and because there's nothing left for her in Moab. Her sons are both dead. Her husband is dead. She's going to go back to Israel, but she knows that the people in Israel will not be kind. History says that they will not be kind to the foreigners. Even though they are commanded to, it's going to be a hard journey for Orpah and for Ruth. So Orpah listens to her mother-in-law and says, I will go back. Goes back to Moab and to look for a new husband among her own people. And Ruth sings this song, and it's very obviously Hebrew poetry. Do not entreat me to forsake you, to turn back from you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people is my people, and your God is my God. Wherever you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. So may the Lord do to me for even more, for only death will part you and me. And Naomi says, okay. And so they go back. And it says that Ruth, this Moabite woman, goes back to Israel. So in making this song, in making this pledge to Naomi, she has claimed Israel and Judah as her home. She has kind of abandoned Moab at this point. At this point in history, there is no conversion rite. Like now there are steps that you go through in a process to become Jewish. In Christianity, we have baptism for initiation. There isn't anything like that, particularly for women in Israel. Men get circumcised. So there's a lot less men converting to Judaism at this time than there are women, for obvious reasons. But Ruth is just saying, this is now me. Wherever you are, that is where I am. I am your daughter, not just your daughter-in-law. In this next section, we have this, it is small town gossip. You notice I have town in parentheses. Bethlehem is still a small town, and at this time, they are almost nothing, just like a collection of maybe 15 households around a well. So everybody knows everybody. Almost everybody's related. And they see Naomi coming and they start gossiping about her. Is this Naomi? She left with a husband and sons, which brings her great honor, and she returns with only this foreign girl. So there's great dishonor in that. And Naomi changes her name because she's mad at God. Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, which means bitterness. It's the antithesis of Naomi, which means sweetness or pleasant. This is also going to remind the hearer, we're already thinking about going into Egypt during the famine, and then all that entails. And now we're thinking of Israel's history again as they are wandering in the wilderness, and they cry out in Mara. They grumble against Moses. And this is when Moses goes and he strikes the rock at Meribah and water springs forth, and God gets mad at him. So we are reminded of the bitterness for Naomi. Once they are in Bethlehem, Naomi begins teaching Ruth of the ancient laws, the Levitical laws, Deuteronomy, Numbers. the things of the law of Moses that God has handed down that will protect them. So they don't have an inheritance. They are technically the property of their husbands, who are both dead now, and they are hungry. So there is this law in Leviticus that states, and when you reap the katsir of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your sedach, neither shall you gather the gleanings of your katsir. And you shall not glean your karem, neither shall you gather every grape of your karem. You shall leave them for the oni and the ger. I am Hashem Elohechem. Now, katsir is harvest, so you don't reap everything out of your harvest. You don't take everything out of your sedek, your field. You don't pick out every grape from your vineyard. You have to leave some behind, and you leave it for the oni and the ger. Oni is poor, afflicted, and the humble, and ger is the immigrant, orphan, and refugee. It means the same thing. So Naomi is an oni. She is poor and afflicted. Ruth is a ger. She is an immigrant, a foreigner, a refugee. This is the same root where we will get, the Yiddish word goyim, or goya, which is somebody that's not Jewish. So we are all, or goy. Now, St. David's folks, Leviticus 19:9-10 should sound very familiar. Why would I say that?
And when you reap your land, you shall not only reap. Ooh.
Is that like the theme for your garden?
Uh-huh. It's written on everything for the garden. Leviticus 19:9-10. This is why we planted the garden, and it is a unity garden the way it is. We plant it. We don't reap everything from it. We don't harvest everything from it, because it is there for the poor, the afflicted, the humble, the immigrant, the foreigner, the refugee.
Cool.
So we are following the Levitical law that is going to benefit Ruth and Naomi. Ruth is sent out by Naomi to the fields. It's harvest time. So they should stand, all these women, these poor women and men, stand on, usually women, because it's the food, will stand on the edges of the field. And when the hired hands, the harvesters, finish and go into the threshing, they are then allowed to go in the evening and pick up everything that has fallen behind. Because as you are harvesting, as you're going in, say you trip and you drop everything on the ground, you're not allowed to pick it up again, according to the law of Moses. It's hit the ground, and now it is an offering for the poor and the needy. So
I would not be allowed to harvest.
Too klutzy.
No, but you definitely be allowed to glean. Because in that oni are widows.
Yeah.
So the widow and the orphan and the poor and the afflicted. So they stand on the edge, and then they go in and they pick up whatever has fallen behind. And usually that's some chaff, and that's just some kernel grains, little bit of grain that has fallen, and you dust it up and take it home and make your bread out of it. And it's a really poor man's bread. And this is the same thing that we see in revolutionary France. The black bread, it's this little bit of flour, a little bit of wheat, but then you're also mixing in chaff, and you're mixing in sawdust, just things to give it steak so that you can eat it and find some nourishment out of it. It's really the bread of the poor. Now, you're not supposed to harvest from any of the corners, so there's full bits there, but if you have to be the first one to get there to get it. So this is what Ruth does. This is, she is sent out, and she finds herself in the field of Boaz, this man of Bethlehem. And Naomi gets all excited because she remembers Boaz, and that Boaz is their relative, and he might be able to help. So Ruth goes out, and is gleaning from the fields of Boaz, and Boaz sees her and likes what he sees. And he starts flirting in the strangest way possible. He tells his servants to leave her alone, let her in early, let her stay late, and why don't you drop a little extra on your way out, just on accident, and leave it for Ruth. So, if that's all flirting was necessary, I'd be married 10 times over by now. But so that she is now learning this Levitical law. Boaz knows this Levitical law and is a righteous man and also really likes Ruth. So drop her a little extra. Little bit about Boaz. One of the explanations given by the rabbis for the crowd who greeted Ruth and Naomi upon their return to the small town is that these people had come from the funeral of Boaz's wife, who died that day. To which the Midrash adds the dry observation, this one went out and this one came in, speaking of Boaz's wife and of Ruth. So his former wife leaves the arena and enters Ruth on the stage. This really kind of fits with the, when God closes a door, somehow he opens a window. I'm sure that's what Boaz is thinking when he's a widower and standing on the edge of his field and Ruth arrives. The Bava Batra, which is another specific midrash, identifies Boaz with the judge Ibzan, which we hear about in Judges 12. Judge Ibzan had 30 sons and 30 daughters, and they all died in his lifetime. So tragedy after tragedy after tragedy. This fact creates an analogy between Boaz and Naomi. They both understand this. A widow who lost her sons, and between him and Ruth, both the experienced loss of a spouse. Their second marriages and the birth of their son, therefore, constitutes a healing for both, not only for Ruth, but also for Boaz and all of Israel in this one little love story. It's possible that the mention of Ibzan in the passage telling of the death of Boaz's wife led the Babylonian narrators to formulate this identification and connect the two characters. So they might be the same, they might not. I like the idea that they are. Also, Boaz is about 20 years older than Ruth. She's probably in her early 20s. She doesn't have any children. Her husband is dead. And Boaz has all this land and is wealthy and of his own. The book of Ruth does not mention that Boaz had a wife and children. It is highly unlikely that an important established man such as Boaz would have remained a bachelor for very long, especially with the choice land that he has. And the death of his first wife and children supports the Ibzan-Boaz connection. One night on the threshing room floor. Just to add to the soap opera-ness of the Hebrew scriptures, after Boaz and Ruth make their first acquaintance, Naomi advises Ruth to wait for him at night in the threshing floor. In the Midrashic account, Ruth has reservations about such an act, being alone with this man, but is nevertheless prepared to heed to her mother-in-law, even if such behavior seems strange to her. Now, the threshing floor is outside of town. You didn't really want to bring all your harvest into the little village, so you would you'd find some place out in the middle of everybody's fields that there's this big flat stone, and kind of build a house over it, and that's where you build a silo basically, and that's where you would do your threshing and separating the wheat from the chaff and then you would just take in the good stuff and you would burn the bad stuff all out in the field. And you would take it into the women then, and they would grind it on the big stone wheels into flour or into meal. So because it is outside the town, the men of the town would take turns sleeping there at night to protect their grain, because being outside of town, robbers can easily come in the middle of the night and steal everything or set fire to it. And so this is why Boaz is sleeping out there, and why it's so strange for Ruth to go there as well. The scene in the threshing floor is described at length by the rabbis. Boaz is startled at first and fears that this might be an apparition. He thinks she's a ghost. That kind of supports this idea that his wife has just died, right? When he learns that she is an unmarried woman, the rabbis portray the inner battle in Boaz's soul, who finally overcomes his physical desires because he really wants her, and he waits for the formal ceremony of redemption. Now, in Ruth chapter 3, verse 4, Ruth does this thing that Naomi has told her to do, which is go in and uncover his feet and fall asleep. The Hebrew noun could mean the place of his feet, and in any case, it is an odd detail. But since the verb of uncovering is the one used in biblical prohibitions of uncovering the nakedness of someone, as Lot's daughters do to him, as Noah's son does to him, this is often seen as a euphemism for engaging in sexual intercourse. And the erotic tease of the narrative is again manifested, but the proposal of such an interpreter that feet means the euphemism for penis is highly dubious in this setting. With everything else that's going on in this story, it's unlikely that that's what it means. What the rabbis have suggested, though, is that Ruth lies down not alongside Boaz, but at his feet. She's not putting herself equal with him, but is expressing her lower social status of a subservient role. And she will say, "My Lord, it is but I. Take your robe and cover your handmaid. Give me your blanket. Because it's cold, because we're outside of town and there's no fire, because we don't want to set the chaff on fire." And when Boaz awakens, he is startled to find the blanket over his feet has moved, and there the blanket should be. He finds this woman. And they have this exchange where she says, "I am Ruth. I am your kinsman through Naomi. You are my kinsman redeemer. Will you save us?" And we'll see a little later exactly what that means. But she's making this plea. And after he's startled and he kind of figures out what's going on, he says, "Yes, I will be your kinsman redeemer. We will make the formal ruling in the city gate before the judges. And I will take you as a wife if I'm able to." So everybody's getting what they want. So what is a kinsman redeemer? A person who, as the nearest relative of another, is charged with the duty of restoring the rights of another and avenging his wrongs. The Hebrew here is actually Goel Ha'adam, which means redeemer of the blood, or of my blood, so my relative. There are 4 duties of the Goel Ha'adam. They are to redeem the relative from slavery, if the latter had been obliged to sell himself into slavery. This will happen multiple times in Scripture, and this is from Leviticus 25, 48 through 49. Megan, would you read this?
Where?
48 through 49.
After they have sold themselves, they shall have the right of redemption. One of their brothers may redeem them, or their uncle or their uncle's son may redeem them, or any one of their family who is of their own flesh may redeem them, or if they prosper, they may redeem themselves.
So this is not chattel slavery. This is not slavery like the American South prior to the emancipation. This is indentured servitude. You cannot be, Israel does not take slaves, but you can sell yourself into slavery to pay off a debt. So it's indentured servitude, which some of my relatives did. That's how they got to North Carolina. Yep, my family's looking at me like, really? That's how a lot of people in North Carolina and South Carolina and Georgia, that's how they got to the colonies, was through indentured servitude. So you are earning wages to pay off a debt, and if you do really well, you can pay it off yourself. But there is this goel hadam, that a relative can also pay off the debt for you. 2 is to repurchase the property of a relative who had to sell it because of poverty. So every 50 years, the ideal is that there's the year of Jubilee in the law of Moses. And in the year of Jubilee, every land, all the land that you have sold, all the deeds go back to the original owner, like way, 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 way back to that family. So you never really sell anything, or you shouldn't really sell anything. You borrow it for a while, and then at the 50th year it returns, or is supposed to. That never actually happened in practice. But this did, that you would sell your property in order to remove yourself from poverty, and then your relative could then buy the land back. This is a strange practice because the land is where you made your living. It is an agrarian culture. 3 is to avenge the blood of his relative. Abraham does this for Lot when Lot is kidnapped by one of the foreign kings, and Abram raises an army and chases them down. So he is practicing the role of the Goel Ha'adam. And 4 is to marry his brother's widow in order to have a son for his brother, in case the brother had not got any son to pass his name forth. Somebody like to read this portion, Deuteronomy 25, 5-6.
I will.
Okay.
When brothers reside together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the deceased shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her, taking her in marriage and performing the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the firstborn whom she bears shall succeed to the name of the deceased brother, so that his name may not be blotted out of Israel.
So the younger brother has taken this widow as his wife, and they have a son. The son does not take the name of the younger brother, but the name of the deceased brother, so that that name may not disappear from Israel. This is what the Pharisees are pointing to when they are trying to trick Jesus in the when he's telling parables, and they say, according to the law of Moses, there is a woman whose husband died and her brother-in-law marries her, and then they'd had no sons, and then he dies, and then the next younger brother, and all the way to 7, right? So they say, who in heaven, whose is she? And this is Jesus' response, that she is nobody's but God's, because marriage and this law is about social security. It is about protecting the family. It is about protecting the woman here on earth, and you don't need that in the afterlife. And the Pharisees are like, oh, well, crap, you're right. And then 5, receive the restitution if the injured related had died. So this is life insurance, right? If the injured party has no next of kin to whom restitution may be made for the wrong, the restitution for wrong shall go to the Lord for the priest, in addition to the ram of atonement, with which atonement is made for the guilty party. So, if you are killed by accident, somebody kills you by accident, then this is not murder, because that is completely different. If somebody kills you by accident, then they are responsible for paying your next of kin So they have killed that you have died. This is a law that is actually going to happen in Norman, England, is going to be revisited, and that's going to happen there. But if there is no next of kin, that offering is given to the priest for the purchase of a ram of atonement, and then that ram is sacrificed on behalf of the person who accidentally killed you. So their guilt is then taken away. Mm-hmm. The role of the Goel Ha'adam, the Redeemer of the Blood, is to restore you to wholeness. It is to remove your guilt and your debt. And this is why the prophet says, I know that my Redeemer lives, and speaking about God. And for Christians, this is why we point to Jesus as our Redeemer. There's a debt that we cannot pay, could not pay, and it is redeemed by our Goel Ha'adam, our Redeemer of the Blood, Jesus. So there's also midrash about Ruth. The rabbis state that Ruth was Orpah's sister, as well as her sister-in-law, not uncommon, and both were the daughters of King Eglon of Moab, who, according to some midrash, was the son of Balak. This fact transforms them from simple Moabite women to members of the royal family, which is going to bolster David's connection to being king, right? Their lineage is significant because David is the descendant of Ruth. David's Moabite origins are linked to royalty, and Ruth and David's being descended from Eglon and Balak is considered to be a reward for them. Balak for establishing altars that he intended to aid Balaam in cursing Israel, so this is a redemption of that role. And Eglon for arising upon hearing the name of God from Ehud, son of Gera, who actually sought to kill the king. Modesty, she's known for modesty. This is why this story on the threshing room floor doesn't necessarily mean that it's a euphemism. The Bible describes Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and her charitable acts, and the Midrashic expansion also stresses her great modesty. The tendency to stress Ruth's modesty is understandable in light of the need to justify the threshing room floor episode. The Bible itself paints the scene in a favorable light and does not criticize Ruth. In seeking to make this scene accord with the norms of modesty practice in their words, the rabbis speak of Ruth's modesty, thus stressing that her going to the threshing floor was not a frivolous action, nor was it the result of an unwariness of the norms prevalent in Judah, but rather resulted solely from her compliance with the wishes of Naomi. So, listen to your mother-in-law. Or not. Offspring. A very considerable number of the Midrashim relating to Ruth are devoted to her descendants from the Davidic line. This exegetic attention is based on the conception that views Ruth as primarily the great-grandmother of King David, which elevates her status as well. Ruth is the mother of royalty. If you all hit your mute for a moment, try to play this through. It's just kind of a real nice summary video. This isn't the same company that did the other ones that we've watched. He breaks it down, and it's almost like a comic book, and it's really great. So this is the story of Ruth in summary and how everything fits together in this poetic setting. Whoops, come back.
The Book of Ruth. It's a brilliant work of theological art, and it invites us to reflect on the question of how God is involved in the day-to-day joys and hardships of our lives. There are three main characters in the book: Naomi the widow, Ruth the Moabite, and Boaz the Israelite farmer. And their story is told in 4 chapters that are beautifully designed. Let's just dive in and see how this all unfolds. Chapter 1 opens with this line: "In the days when the judges ruled." And it reminds us of the very dark and difficult days from the book of Judges. And here we meet an Israelite family in Bethlehem, struggling to survive through a famine. And so in search of food, they move on to the land of Moab, Israel's ancient enemy. And there the father of the family dies, and the sons marry 2 Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then the sons, they die too. And so they leave only Naomi and these new daughters-in-law. And so Naomi, she has no reason to stay anymore. And so she tells her new daughters-in-law that she's moving back home. And Naomi, she knows that the life of an unmarried foreign widow in Israel is going to be very hard. And so she compels the women to stay behind. Orpah agrees, but Ruth does not. She shows remarkable loyalty to Naomi, and she says, "Wherever you go, I'm going to go. Your people will become my people, and your God will become my God." And so the two of them return to Israel together. And the chapter concludes with Naomi changing her name to Mara, which means bitter in Hebrew, and she laments her tragic fate. Chapter 2 begins with Naomi and Ruth discussing where they're going to find food. And it just so happens to be the beginning of the barley harvest. And so Ruth goes out to look for food, and it just so happens that she ends up picking grain in the field of a man named Boaz, who just so happens to be Naomi's relative. We're told that Boaz is a man of noble character, and he notices Ruth. And so after finding out more about her story, he shows remarkable generosity to her. He makes these special provisions so that the immigrant Ruth can gather grain in his field. And in doing so, Boaz is actually obeying an explicit command of the Torah to show generosity to the immigrant and the poor. Boaz is so impressed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi. He prays for her that God will reward her for her boldness. So Ruth comes home that day, and Naomi finds out that she met Boaz, and she is thrilled. She says Boaz is their family redeemer. Now, this family redeemer thing, this was a cultural practice in Israel where if a man in the family died and he left behind a wife or children or land, it was the family redeemer's responsibility to marry that widow, to take up the land and protect that family. So Naomi, she begins to hope that perhaps there might still be a future for her family. Chapter 3 begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan to get Boaz to notice their situation. So Ruth is going to stop wearing clothes of a grieving widow, and she's going to show signs that she's available to be married. And so Ruth goes to meet Boaz on the farm that night. And as she approaches, Boaz wakes up and he's totally startled. And Ruth makes her intentions very clear. She asks if Boaz will redeem Naomi's family and marry her. Boaz is once again amazed by Ruth's loyalty to Naomi and her family, and he calls Ruth a woman of noble character. It's the same term used to describe the woman of Proverbs 31. So Boaz tells Ruth to wait until the next day, and he will redeem both Ruth and Naomi legally before the town elders. And so the chapter ends with Ruth returning to Naomi, and they marvel together at all of these recent events. In chapter 4, it all comes together. It turns out, at the last minute, Boaz discovers there is a family member who's closer to Naomi than he is, and he's actually eligible before him to redeem the family. But at the last second, this family member finds out that he's going to have to marry Ruth, the Moabite, and so he declines. But Boaz, remember, he knows Ruth's true character, and so he acquires the family property of Naomi, and he marries Ruth. And so just at the beginning, how Ruth was loyal to Naomi's family, so now Boaz is loyal to Naomi's family as well. The story concludes with a reversal of all of the tragedies from chapter 1. So the death of the husband and the sons is reversed as Ruth is married again and gives birth to a new son, granting joy to Naomi. And this symmetry between the opening and the closing, it's even more remarkable. So remember, the opening tragedy was followed by a great act of loyalty on the part of Ruth. And that is now matched by Boaz's act of loyalty that leads to the family's final restoration. And this symmetry, it highlights the design of the internal chapters as well. So each of the chapters begins with Naomi and Ruth making a plan for their future, and that's followed by a providential meeting between Ruth and Boaz, and each chapter concludes with Naomi and Ruth rejoicing at what's taken place. This story is beautifully designed, and that design actually connects with a really interesting feature of the story, and that's how little God is mentioned. Right? The characters talk about God a few times, but the narrator actually never once mentions God doing anything directly in the story, and that's its brilliance. Because God's providence is at work behind every scene of this story, weaving together the circumstances and choices of all these characters. So Naomi, her tragedy leads her to think that God is punishing her, but actually the whole story is about God's mission to restore her and her family. And he's doing so through Ruth, through her boldness and loyalty, which brings healing to Naomi's life, but not without Boaz, who's a no-nonsense farmer who's full of generosity and loyalty. And so God uses his integrity combined with Ruth's boldness to save Naomi and her family. And so this story brilliantly explores the interplay of God's purposes and will with human decision and will. God weaves together the faithful obedience of his people to bring about his redemptive purposes in the world. And that leads to the real end of the story. The book of Ruth concludes with a genealogy, showing how Boaz and Ruth's son, Obed, was the grandfather of King David, from whom came the lineage of the Messiah. And so all of a sudden, these seemingly mundane, ordinary events in this story are woven into God's grand story of redemption for the whole world. And so the book of Ruth invites us to consider how God might be at work in the very ordinary, mundane details of our lives as well. And that's what the book of Ruth is all about.
So genealogies are boring, and it just says that Ruth is David's great-grandmother. But right before that, we get this nice little narrative about the birth of Obed. Ruth 4:14 through 17. And the women said to Naomi, "Blessed is the Lord, who has not deprived you of a redeemer today." Notice they call her Naomi and not Mara. "And let his name be proclaimed in Israel. And may he be a restorer of life for you and a support for your old age, as your daughter-in-law, whom you love, has borne him, who has been made to you more to you than 7 sons. And Naomi took the child and placed him in her lap and became a nurse to him. And the neighbor women called a name of him, saying, 'A son is born to Naomi.' And they called his name Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David." So earlier in this story, these women all come out and say, is this not, they're kind of snickering and saying, what's wrong with Naomi? She left with the father, a husband and 2 sons, and comes back with this foreigner. And now they're rejoicing with her. Only here is the name given to a child by neither the father or the mother, not even the grandmother, but by the neighbor women. It is probably a reflection of the importance of the community of women in the story. The name Obed, which occurs elsewhere, means worshiper and is probably a shortened version of Obadiah, worshiper or servant of the Lord. So it's a lovely way to end the story, right? All the women of the town are now rejoicing with these widows who begin the story in grief and sadness. And now there's the birth of this baby who brings them new life and joy. And new life and joy really to the entire community, which is why I think all the women of the town are playing this role. The end.
Why isn't Ruth's son named after her first husband?
So Obadiah Megan says, why isn't Ruth's son named after her first husband? He will be known as the son of, not as the son of Boaz.
Oh, okay.
among the town. But it's such a small town, they probably just know him as Obi. It's Bethlehem at this point, and even Bethlehem at the time that Jesus is born, is Mayberry. It is so Mayberry, and Opie can go everywhere. Or Obi can go everywhere. Aunt Bee or Grandma Naomi brings, dinner down to the threshing room floor and gives it to Boaz. So really, as you leave today, I want you to whistle the Andy Griffith tune and think of Ruth and Naomi. Any other questions? You're on mute, Denise.
Unmute.
There we go. You're unmuted. Nope.
I undid it. I really enjoyed it because I have always liked this story in the Bible, Ruth. I've read it a lot. And so this was nice. This was a nice way to end our Women of the Bible. I liked it.
Good.
In a retelling I saw, one of those musical play things, they portrayed Ruth as being a sacrifice. She was supposed to be a human sacrifice to the gods of
Moab?
Moab.
I actually was in it. There's an opera written by the composer in residence of Dr. Neblock, who was the composer in residence at Blue Lake Fine Arts Camp. He died when he was 101 or 102, just a few years ago. And when he was, 99, he conducted the opera that I was in. I was supposed to just be a stagehand and bring things in, all that. And they realized they needed somebody to bring in the bodies of Kilian and Mahlon. So I got to be an undertaker. I put on a bathrobe and a towel on my head and walked across the stage with this fake body. But I've tried to find some recordings of that. It's a beautiful opera. It's in English and it's really small, kind of like just an hour, and tells this love story of Boaz. But the opera is not just Ruth. The opera is Ruth and Naomi, and it's about their relationship, and it's really, really beautiful. Anything else?
Where would they have gotten the idea that she was a human sacrifice?
I have no idea.
Okay. Just something made up for the production, I guess.
Makes it more exciting. But I think this story doesn't need anything more exciting. We've had the judges, we have the tent stake through the guy's skull, we have all that stuff elsewhere. And this is just, it's an ideal. It's a beautiful pastoral love story that tells us about God's redeeming work in the world.
Normal people in it.
With normal people in it.
Yeah.
No great warriors, just this guy who sees this girl in a field and falls in love with her. I will say, in all the other love stories, this does kind of twist things around. Where does Jacob find his wife?
Well,
At the well. So Jacob finds a wife at the well. Isaac finds a wife, or the servant of Isaac finds a wife for him at a well. That's where you're supposed to find wives, right? You go to a well to find a wife. Well, in this story, the main character is the woman. And she's going to find a husband. She doesn't go to the well. She goes to the threshing floor. This is also going to bring to mind our relationship with God. So on top of Mount Moriah in Jerusalem, there was a threshing floor that King David, Boaz's great-great-grandson, buys from the owners of the field in Salem. he buys the threshing floor, and that's where his son Solomon builds the temple. And it is on that stone, that threshing stone, that the Ark of the Covenant is laid. So this great love story between God and humanity is also made at this threshing floor. Isn't that cool?
It is. So there are no wells now. So men go to bars and order well drinks to find their women.
Yeah.
Does anybody remember well drinks? This is the 70s. You may not.
Oh,
You
no,
youngins.
there's still well drinks.
Oh, okay. I haven't been to a bar since the 70s, so I don't know.
That is a good connection.
Yeah, well drink, yeah.
Well drinks. Good. Well, thank you all.
Thank you, Father.
Happy
Thank you all.
You.
Miss y'all.
Miss you
Me
too.
too.
Yeah.
Ditto.
Okay.
I'm going
Take
to
care.
go cuddle the baby.
Care. Hope to see you soon.
Amen.
Bye.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.